Imagine spending nearly 30 years building one of the greatest fantasy worlds ever created, a world so detailed that people have dedicated entire YouTube channels, podcasts, and careers to analyzing it. Millions of fans, thousands of theories, hundreds of unforgettable characters. It's the kind of legacy most writers could only dream of. But then, someone finishes your story before you do. Not because you wanted them to, but because the adaptation became so successful that it simply couldn't wait anymore. And just like that, the ending people had been waiting decades for was no longer yours to reveal. Whether you loved the final season of Game of Thrones or absolutely hated it doesn't really matter, because the damage, or depending on who you ask, the accomplishment, had already been done. The ending had entered popular culture, people formed opinions, arguments started, memes exploded across the internet, entire characters became symbols of what people believed had gone wrong. And meanwhile, the man who actually created this world still hadn't finished writing it. Every few months, the same question starts making its way around the internet. Is The Winds of Winter finally coming out? For years, the answer has always been no. At this point, it's almost become a joke. Anytime George R.R. Martin posts on his blog or Instagram, tons of people rush to the comments, hoping this is finally the announcement, only to find out he's talking about a new TV project, or another convention, or literally anything except The Winds of Winter. People laugh, they make memes, they say he's never going to finish it. Some have given up completely. Others still believe the announcement is right around the corner. But I think both sides are missing something. Because this isn't just a story about a writer who's taking a long time to finish a book. It's about what happens when a story becomes so massive that finishing it might actually become the hardest part of creating it. And honestly, I don't think George R.R. Martin is struggling because he doesn't know how the story ends. I think he's struggling because now the ending has to carry the weight of everything that came before it. And that's a burden almost no author has ever had to deal with. To understand why we're still waiting, we have to go back to where all of this started, back before HBO. Back before dragons filled television screens, back before Game of Thrones became one of the biggest shows in history. Back to 1996, when A Game of Thrones was first released. George wasn't trying to create the next global phenomenon, he was writing the kind of fantasy story he wanted to read. One that didn't treat good and evil as simple opposites, one where honorable people could lose, where villains could be charming, where heroes could die halfway through the story. At the time, that felt almost revolutionary. Readers had grown used to fantasy stories where the main characters were protected by the plot. Then Ned Stark lost his head, and suddenly everyone realized that nobody was safe anymore. It wasn't shocking for the sake of being shocking. It worked because George had built a world that felt painfully realistic despite being filled with dragons and magic. And that's what made people fall in love with these books. Not because they were unpredictable, but because they were believable. If someone made a mistake, they paid for it. If someone gained power, someone else lost it. Every choice pushed the story forward in ways that felt natural instead of convenient. That level of realism came with a price though, because George wasn't writing a story where every character existed to serve the main plot. He treated them like real people, each with their own goals, their own motivations, their own journeys happening at the exact same time. And every time he introduced another kingdom, another family, another political conflict, the web became more complicated. Most fantasy authors build a road. George planted a forest. That's actually how he describes himself. He doesn't call himself an architect, he calls himself a gardener. An architect knows exactly where every wall will go before construction even begins. A gardener plants seeds, waits to see what grows, and adjusts as the garden changes. It's a beautiful philosophy. It allows characters to surprise even their own creator. Some of the greatest moments in the series probably exist because George allowed the story to grow naturally instead of forcing it toward a predetermined destination. But gardening has one major downside. The bigger the garden becomes, the harder it is to control. And George's garden might have grown larger than anyone expected. The thing about the Song of Ice and Fire is that, for a long time, George was always ahead. The books came first, the television show followed. If you wanted to know what happened next, you picked up the next novel. That was a relationship between the two. One created, the other adapted. But that relationship wasn't always going to last. George has never been a fast writer. And that's not exactly a secret. Even before The Winds of Winter, fans were used to waiting years between books. His process has always been slow because he rewrites constantly, expands storylines, and refuses to force characters into places they don't naturally belong. The problem was, television doesn't work like that. When HBO launched Game of Thrones in 2011, nobody could have predicted just how enormous it would become. And success creates pressure. A television production that expensive can't simply stop for 5 years while the author finishes another book. Actors get older, sets become more expensive, contracts expire, hundreds of people are employed behind the scenes, the machine has to keep moving. Eventually, it did something almost unheard of. It caught up. For the first time, George wasn't writing ahead of the adaptation anymore. The adaptation was waiting for him. Then, it stopped waiting. From that moment on, everything changed. Instead of adapting complete novels, the showrunners had to build future seasons using outlines, conversations with George, and the direction he intended the story to go. That distinction is incredibly important. A lot of people still say Season 8 is George's ending. I don't think that's entirely fair. George has said many times that some of the major destinations are shared. Certain characters are expected to end up in similar places, some major revelations came directly from him, but a destination isn't the same thing as a journey. Imagine someone tells you they're driving from London to Rome. You know where they'll end up, but you have no idea which roads they'll take, whether they'll get lost, or what happens along the way. Stories work exactly the same way. You can reach the same ending through completely different paths. That's one reason so many readers still believe the books can deliver a much stronger ending, even if some of the final outcomes are similar. But here's where I think the real problem begins. Because while viewers were debating whether the ending made sense, George was still sitting in front of a blank page. Imagine spending decades carefully building towards your conclusion, only to watch another version of it become one of the most controversial finales in television history. Even if you promise yourself not to let that influence you, how could it not? Every sentence you write is judged against something that technically isn't even your finished work. I don't know if that would make me rewrite the story, but I do know it would make me question every decision. Not because the audience hated it, but because I'd constantly be asking myself, is this really the best version of this idea? That's a dangerous question for someone who's already a perfectionist, because perfectionism has a strange way of disguising itself as productivity. You convince yourself that one more revision will make the chapter perfect, then another until years have passed, and the finish line somehow feels farther away than when you started. There's another explanation for why The Winds of Winter has taken so long, and that has nothing to do with HBO, nothing to do with fan backlash, and nothing to do with George losing interest. The story itself may have become almost impossible to finish. When people think about an unfinished book, they usually picture one plot that's waiting for an ending. But A Song of Ice and Fire doesn't work like that. It isn't one story, it's dozens of stories happening at the same time. Jon Snow has just been murdered, Daenerys is still thousands of miles away from Westeros, the North is preparing for another war, the others are moving south, Dorne, the Iron Islands, the Vale, the Riverlands, the Citadel. Each of them has their own conflicts unfolding, often without the main characters even knowing about them. And then there are characters like young Griff, who doesn't even exist in the TV show, despite potentially changing the entire political landscape. The point isn't that there are a lot of storylines, it's that every one of them affects the other. If George moves one piece, every other piece has to react. That's what makes this world feel so believable. The world keeps moving even when the characters don't. That's why Westeros feels less like a setting and more like history. But that's also the trap. Because history is messy, it doesn't naturally tie itself into a neat ending. Every chapter George writes has to respect the rules he spent decades creating. One character's death can completely change another storyline hundreds of pages later. He's no longer writing scenes, he's maintaining an entire world. And I think that's the real reason this series became so difficult to finish. George didn't create a story that's hard to end, he created a world that refuses to end neatly. So, after everything we've talked about, the question still remains, will we ever read The Winds of Winter? The honest answer is, I don't know, and I don't think anyone else does either. Over the years, George has said the book is progressing. He shared that he's completed hundreds of pages, rewritten chapters, and even admitted that some characters are much further ahead than others. At different points, he sounded optimistic, at others, he's admitted it's been far more difficult than he's expected. The problem is that we've been hearing some version of that for over a decade. So I understand why so many fans have stopped believing every update. But I also think it's unfair to reduce all of this to a joke. It's easy to laugh and say he's never going to finish it. It's harder to ask why someone who has spent most of his life building this world still hasn't been able to. Because after looking into it, I don't think this is a story about laziness, I think it's a story about expectations. Imagine creating something that millions of people call one of the greatest fantasy stories ever written. Now imagine knowing that no matter what ending you write, some people will hate it. Some people have already convinced themselves it can't possibly live up to the years they've spent imagining it. Others don't even want to get attached because they're afraid they'll never see the end. That's an impossible audience to write for. And maybe that's the lesson here. Sometimes success creates problems that talent alone can't solve. That's an incredible achievement. But it also means every page of The Winds of Winter carries an almost impossible amount of weight. Maybe one day we'll finally get the book, maybe we'll even get A Dream of Spring. I genuinely hope we do. Not because I need every mystery explained, and not because I think it has to redeem the television show. I hope we get it because stories deserve to be finished by the people who started them. Whether George's ending is completely different from the show, or whether it reaches many of the same destinations, I think readers deserve the chance to judge his version. And maybe that's why people are still waiting after all these years. It's not just because they want another fantasy novel, it's because they want closure. Not only for the characters they've followed for decades, but for one of the greatest fantasy series ever written. Until then, Game of Thrones exists in a strange place, finished on television, unfinished in literature. One ending we've all seen, and another that's become one of the biggest mysteries in fantasy itself. Maybe that's the greatest irony of it all. George R.R. Martin created a world built around unanswered questions, and somehow, the biggest unanswered question ended up being whether he'd ever get to finish telling it. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If so, please leave a like or a sub because it would help my channel grow out a lot. And then please drop your thoughts in the comments about Game of Thrones. Whatever you want to say about it. If you think The Winds of Winter will ever come out. What you thought about the ending of the television show. Say whatever. And then, I'll see you guys in the next one.